welcome. You are at Deep Dive, Benefits of Cultural and Prescribed Burning. Our moderator today is Erica Tom, Director of Native American Studies at Sonoma State University, with 3 esteemed panelists who she will introduce. My name is Carrie, and I'm the Educational Outreach and Communications Lead with the Center for Environmental Inquiry at Sonoma State University, and I'll be handling the technical things today. So let me know if there's anything you need by sending me a message in the chat. Our public events are usually done at our preserves, but have gone virtual since the start of the pandemic, and we are slowly easing back into a hybrid model. Hikes and training sessions are in person, and public events like this are about half virtual, half in person at our Galbraith and Osborne preserves and the main SSU campus. You can find a full listing on our calendar page, for which I will paste a link into the chat. First off, before we do anything, if I could have everybody please take a moment to type your full name into the chat box. This is going to be our sign-in sheet for the day. And this is especially important if you're here with a class and would like to receive credit for attending. So just go ahead and type in that chat box your name. If you'd like to include your role so other people can see it, that's fine. If you'd like to be anonymous, you can send that message just to me. Before the presentation, I want to tell you a little bit about what the Center for Environmental Inquiry is and how we can be a resource to you. The center manages Fairfield Osborne Preserve, which encompasses 450 acres on Sonoma Mountain, as well as Galbraith Preserve, 3,670 acres in Yorkville, Mendocino County, and our smallest, Los Guilicos Preserve in Kenwood. What we do at the center is mobilize faculty, students, and community to solve complex environmental challenges, turning education into action. And we invite you to join our diverse community of learners and problem solvers, no matter your background or your connection to the university, because all sectors of society are critical if we want to truly get a tackle on the biggest environmental challenges in human history. And we want you to leave today with a better understanding of our connection with the environment and skills that lead to sustainable solutions. That said, there are many ways to get involved, everything from engaging in research to us, taking one of our training programs, such as our naturalist or land management programs, both of which you can go to info sessions this week to learn more about. You can learn about the virtual field collaboration for undergraduate classes. There's internships, student jobs. We have data you can access, come to events, lead events, partner with us on projects, or help create more programs like this by donating, since these are fully funded by the generous support of donors. And do come to our Saturday hikes starting in a month or two. Those are in person, and we'd love to see you there at 10 a.m. on Saturdays at Osborne Preserve. Thank you all for joining today. Please just know that each of you has a role to play, and I really hope you'll choose to get environmentally ready with us as we tackle these great challenges. Today, we are going to focus in on the benefits of cultural and prescribed burning. Erica Tom will introduce the topic, the presenters, and invite questions. Then we'll have a panel discussion for about 35 minutes before taking questions from the audience. And we do have a hard stop at 3 o'clock. Feel free to email me after the event for any follow-up. I will put my email in the chat, and it's the same address you received when you got your confirmation email from registration. So again, please do keep your audio turned off unless you have something to contribute during the Q&A session. And feel free to type into the chat anything you need from me or questions you have. And with that, I am excited to turn it over to Erica.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for that informative and exciting introduction. It makes me want to do more and be have a bigger engagement with the Center for Environmental Inquiry. So thank you so much. As Carrie mentioned, I'm the Director of Native American Studies at Sonoma State University. And we are so glad to be collaborating with the Center for Environmental Inquiry and with our really incredible speakers today. Sonoma State University sits on the borderlands of the Southern Pomo and Coast Miwok nations, the descendants of whom today are the enrolled citizens of the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria. The mission of the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria is social justice and environmental stewardship. The tribe hopes and encourages the larger community to join them in this necessary mission. And for anyone who is unfamiliar with Graton Rancheria, I'm including a link to the tribe's website here so that you can learn more. It is my pleasure to introduce these three speakers. I am so excited for how many people are here today and from so many different parts of our communities. If you have questions throughout the talk, I'd like to invite you to put your questions into the chat. I will be keeping track of those, and we'll make sure that, that we're able to bring up those questions at the end of the talk. So it's with pleasure that I introduce our three speakers. Tony Marx Block is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology, Geography, and Environmental Studies at California State University, East Bay. He was raised in Ohlone territories in the San Francisco Bay Area and is a settler of Eastern European Jewish descent, whose pedagogy and scholarship are guided by anti-colonial movements. Tony's research aims to support Indigenous efforts to maintain and strengthen their culture and sovereignty, with a focus on the socio-ecology of prescribed and cultural fire. Peter Nelson, Coast Miwok and tribal citizen of the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria, is an assistant professor of environmental science, policy and management, and ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. Dr. Nelson received his PhD in anthropology from UC Berkeley. Dr. Nelson works at the intersection of anthropological archaeology, Indigenous environmental studies, and Native American studies in collaboration with tribal nations and Indigenous peoples in California and abroad. His research addresses cultural heritage preservation, settler colonialism, climate change, and Indigenous stewardship and land management. Dr. Nelson also volunteers on prescribed burning projects and wildland firefighting efforts in the North Bay area where he lives. Brian Peterson, consulting fire ecologist for Audubon Canyon Ranch, received a master's degree from San Francisco State University in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology in 2015. His graduate research investigated the relationship between seed-catching rodents, and manzanita recruitment after fire. Getting his start in 1997 doing oak woodland restoration and fuels reduction work in Southern Oregon, Brian has gone on to work as a botanist and vegetation ecologist all across California floristic Providence, including on research projects at the Farallon Islands, Yosemite's Uyet Valley, Sierra Foothills, Mount Diablo State Park, Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, Sugarloaf State Parks, and Pepperwood Preserve. Y'all are so accomplished, it's tongue-tying me here. Most recently, he has been working with nomad ecology, where he has focused on botanical studies and post-fire chaparral. Brian has completed 2 prescribed fire training exchanges, tracks, and is trained as a wilderness first responder. All right, so our first question to begin this conversation here is, what is cultural burning and prescribed fire? How are they similar to or different from each other? What are some of the key differences between these forms of fire and ecosystem stewardship versus wildfire and wildland firefighting?
Yeah, so I think we can all just kind of jump in where we feel we can offer some answers here. So when we're getting into this issue of prescribed or cultural burning, I just wanted to hop in and provide a little bit of historical context so that hopefully will lead into where we are today a little bit. And so first off, I want to say, thank you to the organizers, and it's really wonderful to be here, especially zooming in from my house in Santa Rosa, in Southern Pomo territory and the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria. I'm a tribal citizen and I'm Coast Miwok by descent. And, my family is from the Tamales Bay area, so a little bit further south in Graton territory. So I should also say that as a Native person, all these opinions and things that I'll say today aren't reflective of official tribal views. They're my own views and my own scholarship and, things that I've learned and taken in myself. And so, I just wanted to point that out that, oftentimes, representation is a really important issue, and making sure that, official representation from, official tribal representatives versus individual tribal citizens, that distinction is made. And so I just wanted to make that clear. But, getting into some of the history, more generally in California, as well as here in Sonoma and Marin counties, so there's really great, Erica shared the Graton website. There's a really great timeline of some of the history there as well. So I'd like to point you to those resources. But just as a kind of general introduction to cultural burning, cultural burning was practiced in California for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so Native peoples of California all throughout the state, as well as other places in the Southwest, the Northwest, other places in the country practiced cultural burning. And so, what is this concept of cultural burning? So people were using fire for many, many different reasons. And, some of that had to do with indigenous stewardship or our relationships with the plants and the environment around us. It could have to do with opening up areas that would be essentially used for habitation, for travel for both humans and non-humans, animals. Burning had all of these different uses. Essentially, when you're looking at different kinds of plant materials, either for food, for tools, for medicine, there are certain plants that respond really, really well to fire. And when you're taking care of these plants, when you're tending to those plants, essentially, what you're doing is you're finding out, just like in a garden, if a plant likes fertilizer or a plant likes water a certain frequency during the day or a frequency during the week, those things are tending to those plants and taking care of them. And in the same way, some of these plants and whole landscapes really are adapted to fire and need that fire to maintain health and sustainability of what's there. And so basically in these systems, Native people throughout all of these areas, including, again, Sonoma and Marin County, were using fire to enhance what was here on the landscape. And so say like basketry material, willow and hazel especially, would have been burned, and things like deer grass and other sorts of basketry materials throughout California, they actually grow more abundantly and healthfully when you burn those things. So burning can be a really useful tool for all of these different reasons. And again, going back to kind of the historic or ethno-historic record, you can see really early instances of burning throughout California by Native people. If you go back to Jose Altamira, who was essentially traveling from the Mission Dolores over to what would be the site of the mission in Sonoma, essentially in 1823, on his journey, he described the landscape. And so he has all of these really interesting comments on the ecology of the area, even the stones in Sonoma County. You might see a whole bunch of rock piles and just rubble all over. He mentioned some of those things in his descriptions of the county, as well as documenting Tole Lake and the size and length of that lake, as well as he was really keyed into the issue of where the Spanish could ranch cattle and take care of those cattle. So he was really interested in open grassland environments, and he documented those in many places across the county. And so when you're thinking about these really, really open landscapes in Central California, you have to consider the ecology of this area and climate and these other factors that, essentially here, we don't really see a lot of lightning strikes. And so if you don't see a lot of lightning strikes like we do, say, in Southern California or further east, a lot more of these environments should be probably, closed up more, converting back to woodlands and into conifer forest. And so the maintenance or the stewardship of these coastal prairies and grasslands in Central California are the direct result of cultural burning by Native people. And that's certainly what Jose Altamira observed over at Tole and, the Sonoma mountain range, as well as over into essentially the town of Sonoma and the hills around there. And he even specifically mentioned, this was in July in 1823, he mentioned that the hills were blackened by the burning of Native people in that area. And so actively in that time, even through missionization, people were still in the area. It wasn't a complete, removal of Native people at the beginning of missionization. It was a process that continued over decades, and people were still in these areas and still burning and stewarding these landscapes. And so you see that in that record, as well as in the archaeological record within some of my work at Tole and out at Point Reyes down in Central California and other parts of the area. Kent Lightfoot, Rob Cuthrell, a number of different scholars have taken a look at this issue in different ways, either with archaeological botanical materials or pollen cores and sediment records, dendrochronology and fire scars and tree rings, all sorts of different ways of looking at fire histories in the past and how much we can stretch that timeline back into the deep past to show evidence of Native burning. And of course, our elders have oral traditions of burning taking place since time immemorial. And so all of this data combined creates this picture of what cultural burning is, the importance of that burning to Native people in all of these areas, as well as the importance of bringing some of those things back today, because a lot of those practices have either been limited or disrupted completely by colonialism. In the 1860s, 1850s, and 60s, with California becoming a state in the United States, essentially the legislature or Congress met, and some of the first laws on the books in terms of California laws were to ban burning of the landscape. And so you can go back and read some of those things, some of these really early laws. This was a time when genocide was going on in California. If you've read Ben Madley's book, American Genocide, there are a number of other books by other scholars, Native and non-Native scholars, talking about these different issues. But at this time, essentially Native people's movements and livelihoods were severely limited by colonialism, and people navigated that system to do the best that we could to survive and to actually thrive in those times and preserve our cultures and take those on into the future, which is what we have preserved now, thanks to those elders that carried those things forward. But we're in a time now of restoration where some people have continued practicing burning, but many people in California have not been able to do that because of all of these colonial laws, not just in that early statehood, but going on into the 1900s with fire suppression. And, you may have seen Smokey the Bear and all of these different propaganda sort of campaigns, which, good intention, trying to, help and protect the general public. It was very much concerned with public safety, but also, wrapped up in industry and economy and timber and the commodification of our different tribal territories, which are stolen Native lands. through that process of colonialism. So again, we come back up into the present with a situation where we have this patchwork of different people working in different ways, advocating for indigenous stewardship, tending the land in the ways that they can, getting access in different ways. But people learning as well through that process. And this is how I came to do some of the firefighting work that I do, as well as prescribed burning, which is a little bit different than what we would necessarily do in a cultural burning framework. But again, because of this process, I'm coming to the practice of prescribed burning to learn more about fire and to be able to practice it in a context here where we don't have many opportunities to do cultural burns right here in the local area yet. But that's changing. I see a lot of momentum in the direction of how policies are changing, and agencies and other landowners being more open to the issue of either prescribed or cultural burns being implemented. And so we'll talk about what is the difference between these cultural burns that are rooted in tending the land from indigenous practices and indigenous knowledge that goes back thousands of years, and then what some of the goals and are of prescribed burning as well. And so if one of my other colleagues wants to hop in and talk about prescribed burning, that would be fantastic.
Tony, did you have anything you wanted to add to that at all?
You can go first if you want to, Brian.
I was going to talk about some of the more boring aspects of prescribed fire. So,
all right. Well, just quickly, I think thanks for having me. And with regard to what Peter spoke about, I think it's important to acknowledge that much of the prescribed burning, the early prescribed burning by European settlers in California, was really appropriated knowledge and practice from indigenous peoples here in California. So many of the ranchers and even timber barons who adopted the practice really were adopting the practices they had seen from indigenous peoples throughout California and across the United States. And so this the use of prescribed fire, however, was, as Peter alluded to, was outlawed by various state and federal agencies once in the early 20th century. And so this was done primarily because it was felt that fire was a threat principally to timber and the regeneration of timber, and that being a really important commodity of the large and powerful timber industry, who really lobbied for this policy to be implemented by the Forest Service and the state of California. And however, over time, there was somewhat of a rediscovery of prescribed fire, and many timber managers observed that the accumulation of fuel, in particular, when fire is suppressed and removed from the landscape, has particularly detrimental effects on the forest, and it makes it more susceptible, of course, to high severity fire, as we're seeing in California today. And so the reintroduction of fire for what is called ecological purposes in the National Park Service in particular, and even in the state parks, right, in California, a lot of that has been oriented towards this somewhat vague ecological purpose that doesn't necessarily integrate the same type of objectives as cultural burning that Peter mentioned, which is really about maintaining native culture and livelihoods, from my own experience. And thanks for being here, Alex Watts-Tobin from the Karuk tribe, representing the Karuk tribe, because I've learned a lot, in particular in my own research, from Karuk leaders and Yurok leaders in that part of California. But I think just to wrap up, that there are many distinctions between prescribed and cultural fire that I've observed, in that prescribed fire is really oriented towards one primary goal, which is fuel reduction, to reduce wildfire risks, to protect commodities primarily, whether that be timber or real estate. And so many of the federal laws have been geared towards protecting the wildland urban interface, which, again, is a quite different matter from conducting a burn to maintain basketry resources or to improve habitat for elk and deer. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I can just quickly add from the perspective of, being a prescribed fire practitioner myself, and a background in ecology, botany, vegetation management, ecology and stuff. Like as Tony said, there's these reasons that prescribed fire has been used in the past by, say, forestry, and for fuels reduction. I think, for me, it's a goal to expand that use of prescribed fire for more ecological purposes, and hopefully to collaborate and work with tribes to help support cultural burning as well. It's such a really hard, complicated history. I mean, one thing that has happened too, like in that history that everyone just described, is that the use of fire, it was made illegal to burn, but it was also still used by foresters when they were allowed. So basically it was taking fire, it was controlling who is allowed to be a fire practitioner. And that was basically white European foresters and landowners, or the Forest Service. And for this one specific goal, typically of timber or protecting timber. And to some degree protecting houses and structures, but I think a lot of it was to protect timber. And that's where a lot of the kind of Gifford-Pinchot policies came in. But yeah, I would just like, as working in Sonoma County, Marin County, it's really a goal of my personal goal is to expand that the term, prescribed fire is something, we use fire as a tool to reach certain objectives. And I think, like Alex had said, typically it's really focused on fuels reduction and wildfire prevention. And I think that's a mistake. It would be nice to kind of push out of that. It's interesting situation we're in, kind of as Peter was talking about with all of this history. We have a situation where people who have the tools and who are allowed to do this kind of thing are typically suppression firefighters, who are not necessarily trained and or don't have that mandate to burn for other reasons than for suppression. There's also a whole slew of liability issues that are fundamental to some of the problems we have. And one is, if you don't burn, no one cares. If you burn, then you've started a fire, and that's a potential liability. So a wildfire is considered an act of God. And if you go put out a wildfire as, say, a fire agency, you're a hero. If you try to prevent that wildfire from happening in that way, by using prescribed fire or other preventative stuff, it's a human caused disaster if that fire escapes, and then you're therefore liable. So there's a lot of barriers and a lot of issues with liability and stuff like that. And that's why I said I was going to talk a little bit more about some of the more boring things of prescribed fire. And I could go on with that stuff for a long time, but just to offer a little perspective in that sense of the world.
Thank you, all three of you, for those different contributions that meld together, really setting a foundation for thinking about histories of cultural burning and prescribed fire. And I think, Brian, you've led us to our next question. We have about 17, 20 minutes or so left of conversation here, and we have two more questions, but one that you've really led us into is why so many more people are even aware, right, of terms like prescribed fire, and that's because of the extreme wildfires that we are experiencing today. So if someone can speak a bit to why we're experiencing these extreme wildfires, was it always this way? How have people lived here with fire in the past? How can we continue to live here with fire into the future?
Yeah, so you know, I think I can speak a little bit to that. You know, so referring back to some of the things that I had said before, you know, essentially what we're seeing today and why we're seeing a lot of these wildfires is we've really, you know, changed the landscape quite a bit. And I say we as in, you know, this whole, you know, like, you know, colonial state that is here now. So in the past, the landscape looked quite a bit differently, was managed or stewarded quite a bit differently, with fire being a part of that landscape. You know, essentially people reading the land and quite intimately interacting with it in all of these different spaces. And so the idea of wilderness isn't really an indigenous concept in terms of, you know, the areas that we have today that essentially are completely separate and, you know, portioned off from people's involvement or interaction, other than maybe like a skinny little trail where you can go through, you can take some pictures and get out of there. So it's a very different way of relating to the landscape than a cultural landscape, in the sense of something that's imbued with value, where resource patches are tended and useful and productive and feed into, you know, cultural crafts and, you know, food and other sorts of things that that we have there. So you know, that active engagement, when you take that away, you see a reforestation of a lot of areas in unhealthy or unproductive ways, in terms of us as human beings living in these places sustainably with the environment around us. And again, there are many historical instances of this. You know, I can share an article by Liebman and a group of scholars working out of the Southwest, who went back and looked at the fire history of that area in, you know, in comparison to when the mission system was, and saw when there was mass depopulation of that area, Native people being drawn into those missions. Essentially, that's when you see this reforestation happening, and quite a few wildfires happening after that, with people not managing that area. So, you know, of course, it's going to be different in every different region. Colonialism happened a bit differently and at different times and at different scales in every place. But when you take that active engagement off of the landscape, when you change that system of stewardship by taking Indigenous people, you know, removing Indigenous people from those places, or inhibiting or limiting our ability to practice these cultural practices, that really drastically changes and redraws the map in a colonial image of what, you know, these agencies and land managers want to see out there. You know, and so again, you know, that's been in the interests of timber, in the interests of, say, like the national parks, which we all, you know, many people have very good feelings about, because, you know, they're at least preserved in a way that, you know, they're not going to be completely built over and urbanized. But again, we need to have more active engagement on these lands, you know, doing burns and other things, because what we're seeing now is these wildfires. You know, if we have these lightning storms that come in. We're having changes because of climate change, and seeing different sorts of weather patterns and storms and other things that we haven't seen so much in the past. And so whether it's a fire caused by humans or a fire caused by nature, it's basically like a tinderbox waiting to ignite when you have these areas that haven't been tended and have so much fuel running throughout them. And so we're seeing these wildfires because of this management strategy that has been relatively hands-off with a lot of our open spaces and wilderness areas and national parks. And so the way to change that would be to reintegrate that sort of engagement with the lead of Native people and of tribes, having essentially a lead role in how that land management or stewardship is done. So anyway, I'll leave it to some of my colleagues to add to that as well. Yeah,
I would say, Peter, just a key into that is that, we have to be doing some more work in these areas, but like you just said, it needs to be the right work, because there has been a lot of management in these forests, but it's typically for timber extraction, or making wool for World War I or something like that. These really extractive things, and it's important to remember that history as well. And as that colonial state's managing or has one thing in concern, and that's extracting resources, profit, and getting those resources. That's what basically the Sierra has been managed for many, many, many years. So it's really no surprise that we're getting these fires.
Yeah, and then with the added growth of ex-urban development within areas where there weren't nearly as much built infrastructure in the past, right? But I would say, in terms of moving forward with how to relate to fire and how to live with fire, I think it'll be really fundamental for various agencies to invest in indigenous-led fire management and care moving forward. You can't just expect Native groups that have been dispossessed and have been really in this process of restoration from the initial colonial encounter and the ongoing settler colonialism to have the resources to support re-envisioning the way that fire is managed. So really there needs to be an investment, a major investment, not just in fire management, as the state has been putting more money into prescribed fire teams and all of this, and giving some money to indigenous fire stewardship as well, but there needs to be much more so that tribes can really build up their programs so that they can have robust teams of people to lead us in understanding how to live in this place that they've lived in for so long.
Yeah, Tony, that's really, really important point. I'd like to share something someone told me today. I was in a fire class, and the instructor's been doing a suppression fire for a long time and moved into more resource fire in ecological burning, and is also a teacher. And he said one day of aerial resources like planes or helicopters dropping waters could pay for any one of the programs that we are in, right? So a couple $1 million for one day of that kind of thing. Imagine that the kind of money if we invested that into yeah, and like Tony said, actually putting money and investing in tribal management of these lands.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. I just want to share, folks in the chat are just appreciating all of these perspectives and information that you're bringing forward. With maybe about 8 minutes, 10 minutes more of conversation before we break out for some questions. Our last question for conversation here is, how can we learn more about sustainable fire stewardship of our ecosystems? What kind of fire research is being conducted in our area? What can this research tell us about the benefits of fire in terms of cultural purposes in the environment and public safety?
Well, I just think this is an opportunity to highlight how Peter and Brian and myself have come together. We're trying to begin to investigate the effects of prescribed and cultural fire on a really important resource for indigenous peoples throughout California, which is acorns. And so wherever we see oak trees in California, they have been managed with fire for millennia. And when we take that out of the equation, we see indigenous peoples have seen a decline in the quality of acorn due to infestations and the unchecked infestation of various insects. And so Fire Forward and the Audubon Canyon Ranch, given their ongoing leadership in Sonoma County to try and bring fire back to the landscape, has really opened up some opportunities to evaluate how this reintroduction of fire impacts acorn production and infestation. And so that's one of the things that we're interested in, because of course acorns have sustained peoples here for generations, and trying to figure out how to best do so moving forward is one of our objectives.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up what Tony was saying in terms of, talking about the research project that we have here in Sonoma County, looking at, prescribed burns that are already happening, and, what we can observe, post-fire, and, learn about the effects of that fire on acorns is really important to know. In these different contexts, like with wildfire, we see, some, really destructive effects of wildfire, but also some benefits as well, with different plants returning, which, shouldn't be downplayed. There are good effects to wildfire, even though it's somewhat of a negative thing that has a lot of negative connotations because of the mass destruction that it brings to, say, old growth, in our forests, and, structures that are burned and property that's destroyed. And so these really beneficial parts of prescribed and cultural burning, are bringing those benefits without as much of those, really destructive components of those wildfires. We're really setting low intensity fires on the landscape that burn through just, the lower levels, the small plants on the forest floor, the duff through the woodlands, and really maintains those areas, as well as Tony is saying, these pests that get into our acorns and make it really difficult to gather. When you go through, you see the little holes from these worms, through all of these acorns. And in terms of, I think that I froze. Sorry about that.
You're coming through clear on our end.
You're
okay,
good. Yeah.
So it was just the video. All right. Awesome. Yeah, you can see the little holes from these insects, and it's partly an efficiency thing, but also, like if you're trying to go through and do this for subsistence and gather acorns for food, you don't want just a handful out of an entire tree that you've been sorting around for, a couple of hours. You want to be able to gather many, many more of those things. And so, being able to, tend and steward these different trees and help them along and produce really viable acorns, many more of them, really helps with all of us gathering acorn for food. So one of the organizations where you can find out more about fire is Audubon Canyon Ranch and the Fire Forward program. That's where I've been learning a lot, as well as getting on the ground experience with fire, and where I'm able to actually practice that and interact and develop that relationship with fire in my own territory. I also go some other places, to do prescribed burns as well. But, within Marin and Sonoma County, ACR, or Audubon Canyon Ranch, has been a really amazing organization and, a nexus point for people to come together and learn more about fire. And I think Brian can speak more to the organization and opportunities that are available.
Yeah, so I'll try to make this quick. I know we're pressed for time a little bit, but I am going to get up on my soapbox here. And bullhorn, and just as Peter had said, as a good pass off. So one thing that Fire Forward does, spends a lot of time doing is training firefighters. And when I say training firefighters, I mean ecologists, nerds, computer programmers, people in their 60s, 70s who want to come out and help with prescribed fires. So we get people trained to firefighter 2, that's the basic wildland firefighting, so that they can come out to fires and learn a little bit. That's through the Good Fire Alliance, which is a local prescribed fire association, which is a community network of people interested in fire. So anyone can join the Good Fire Alliance. You just join and that's it. It's really chill. And that's a good way to get in contact with the fire community. I want to just reiterate over and over again, this is not hard to jump into. The class takes some hours, but it's for everybody. That's really what we're trying to do. So please don't be intimidated. If you're interested, take the class, the basic firefighter class. So that's one thing I'll say. I think that's a great way to get involved, like Peter was saying. Also, I know there's a lot of students in here, and so I'd like to just deeply advocate for, I imagine a lot of you might take an interest in the subject and want to move on and continue your studies in different ways or do research. I beg of you, I'm really a big advocate for the bottom up approach when it comes to research questions. So please, come out and work with us or come out and talk to people who are doing stuff on the ground, reach out to local tribes, wherever you're working, reach out to the people that are on the land and help form questions that way. There's so much good work to be done right now. There's so many questions, both ecologically and fire, like in the environmental sciences, but also like social science stuff. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that could happen. And I just believe there's a lot of us working on the ground, or just questions are exploding out of our head and we have no time because we're doing all this other work. So yeah, that's what I'd say, get your ideas from the people doing the work and bring that to your professors. Tell them what's up. Cool. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And what Brian is really referring to is what I think a lot of us folks at Sonoma State are thinking about and working on, right? Community engaged research, right? Participatory research, right? Where we're parts of our communities and what we're doing. I so appreciate, again, having the three of you together and responding to each of these questions is just weaving together really beautifully. And thank you for folks who have been putting resources into the chat. I'm clicking on them so I can save them for after the chat here. I know we have some additional questions, but one of the questions that came up earlier, Hadizbas asked, can you speak more to the barrier to burning, such as liability and air quality issues? So just expanding a little bit more on your responses to the second question.
Speaking of potential PhD dissertations, that's you could pick one small area of barriers. I can really quickly just throw out there that there's been in the past, in the 90s, air quality was a huge barrier, and any older practitioners who've been at it for a long time are always griping about air quality being a barrier. And what we've seen, especially since all these fires, is air quality is hugely an ally at this point. they've been really great to work with. So I just want to throw kind of a shout out to them. They've been like so cool and rising to the moment and working with us. That said, liability is a huge barrier. It's actually a really big, interesting conversation, but like, yeah, there's really no one to ensure the work. There's also questions about who's actually going to pay for this work. We're a nonprofit. We're working mostly on grants, and we're trying to push the good work. But at some point, all this fire money is going to start needing to go into, kind of as Tony was talking about, like towards tribes and indigenous fire management, as well as prescribed fire, all this stuff, instead of big helicopters. And those money routes, all that money, the routes for funding streams are pretty well eroded towards suppression. And so we need to get out of that. That's a barrier as well, in my opinion. There's lots of interesting other tiny barriers, politically. Again, no one wants to burn because it has risk. But everyone wants their forest to look good. So we got to kind of figure out where our resources. And I would also say something we're working on is the actual skill and ability to do these burns. So just because someone's trained in fire suppression does not necessarily mean they're trained in prescribed burning and burning at the right times and all this kind of stuff. So we need to kind of invest in kind of reimagine the workforce. And those are some barriers I can think of.
If Peter or Tony, if you don't have more to add to that, there's another question.
I'll say just quickly,
please.
Unless Peter, you want to say it. I was just going to say, for indigenous peoples in particular in California, there's the question of land and access to land. Because with the passage of certain recent laws at the state level, SB 332, cultural burners have more liberty and don't necessarily have to have the same restrictions on them when they're deciding to burn. But Native peoples don't have access to their ancestral territories. So that's a huge barrier, particularly when you have large federal landowners that don't allocate sufficient resources toward burning on ancestral Native territory. And so that's a huge barrier in that the Forest Service and other public land agencies don't turn over or give more power to Native tribes to conduct burning on their own terms.
Yeah, Tony, thanks for saying that. And I just wanted to, it reminded me of another barrier I just want to throw out there that's really common is, Tony mentioned this new legislation in the past that had less restrictions on cultural burners. And when there's a lot of restrictions on what it takes to be what's called a burn boss or run a burn and be within your due diligence, that means if something goes wrong, they're like, oh, you're qualified to do this. Someone at the Nature Conservancy points out that to become a burn boss by federal standards at this point, outside of this bill that Tony's talking about, takes longer than it does to become a brain surgeon. So that's a huge barrier because you can actually become competent much faster than that. And also, if you don't work for the federal government, you're never going to get those qualifications. So the whole qualification and how one becomes competent the system is also completely broken if you want to do non-suppression firework.
Thank you both so much. One of the questions, we've got 4 more minutes, and this is a great question here, so I'd love to get at least some short thoughts on this. Mariana has asked, would the panelists be willing or able to share more about the intersection of cultural burning and prescribed firework with local ranchers' cattle operations? With the large ungulates before colonization largely removed from the landscape and replaced by beef cattle, curious about thoughts on moving forward in land management.
Yeah, I think that, while this isn't really my area of expertise, I can offer a few thoughts, and Brian and Tony may know quite a bit more. So I think that this is probably an area where there's a lot of there hasn't been a lot of work done in terms of collaborations between tribes and ranchers and private entities and agencies. And we're starting to see that, I think, in many areas around the issue of fire, though, at least in this area, that hasn't happened so much. I think a lot more people do, like pile burns and things of that nature, but in terms of, large scale broadcast burns, I don't think that, at least my tribe in this area is involved in that with like private entities. Certainly there are some, agencies, and also, like ACR is doing burns, prescribed burns in the area. So there are collaborations on that in a sense. But yeah, in terms of, that, it would be like any other sort of project where there would be government to government consultation, and at that level of compliance, working through, how that would be done between a tribe and an agency or an organization or something like that. But yeah, I think we're just at the point where, those discussions are starting to happen, in a lot of different places, which is really exciting. But, as I said, I think it's something that, there hasn't been a lot of, but we're going to see more in the years to come. And I'd be happy to hear, what Brian and Tony have to say about that too, because again, it's not as much of my area of expertise.
Well, I feel that this is the moment where we say that we need a follow-up event, just because I know that Carrie has asked us to hard stop at 3 o'clock. So I just want to note that so many folks are also asking some questions and just expressing their interest. And I think that's really right. That's the intentions of these events. And so I feel while we do not have the time for the three of you to answer all of the questions and concerns of folks in the audience, I think we've really reached that goal that Carrie set out at the beginning. And so I'm really grateful to each of you for your time and sharing of your knowledge.
Truly, I am also from the center. I just want to say it's just incredible. A sincere thank you to Erica, Peter, Brian, Tony, and everyone who's contributing to this important conversation. I'd like to express gratitude on the part of the center as well, to specifically the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria, who are working with the center to promote environmental stewardship and resume traditional practices that revitalize stressed ecosystems through things such as a grant for a learning center at SSU's Osborne Preserve that will provide a forum for open communication on best practices, and through their support of our naturalist program to bring Roanoke Park Cotati Unified School children up to the land. So again, this is just an incredible moment and event for me to be a part of, and I'm really appreciative. Before we go, I do want to just put a couple things in your chat there. I put in my email address. I put a calendar of events for the center, public events, because this is just one of almost 24 events this semester, both online and on our preserves. One of them is Galbraith Wildlands Preserve in Yorkville, Mendocino County. We also have them on the main campus, and we have them at Osborne Preserve. So a large list of events coming up. And one of them that I wanted to highlight was in regards to the naturalist training program to bring those students up to the preserve. And you can join this Sunday, February 6th, for an event called Naturalist Ed Series, Birds and How to Observe Them. And you can either come just to come to that event, or you can dive deeper and use it as part of your training to become an Osborne naturalist. We also have a Building Resilience series that might interest some people here. It's a year-long conversation to increase community collaboration on resilience to climate change. So this specific event is going to be on preparing infrastructure to minimize impacts of extreme events, but they take place the second Wednesday of every month at noon online. And then lastly, for professors or high school teachers in the audience and anyone who wants to join, I highly encourage you to take a look at the webpage for the Live from the Field events. The first one coming up is Conservation Through Art and Science, That one's on February 14th. And these events were designed specifically during the pandemic to give classes of students virtual field experiences and access to multiple experts across the country in one virtual space. And they really are designed to incorporate into your course curriculum. We have instructor guides, reading materials, assignments. So if you're looking for like a guest lecturer, this is a really great way to do that. So we already are at 3 minutes after, but please do feel free and email me any questions or comments about this. Perhaps the event panelists would be willing to answer things in writing afterwards. So please do continue this conversation. And thank you to everyone who was involved. Have a fantastic rest of your day.